Me About It, a podcast by SLPs for everybody. I'm Francie.
And I'm Maggie.
And we're here to demystify, I just totally forgot it. We're here to demystify the big world that is speech, language, and communication.
Today we are talking about the Telepathy Tapes, and there's a lot to talk about, so let's jump right in. So this is a special Scams and Swindles episode of Tell Me About It. Today we're diving into the Telepathy Tapes.
Oof.
If you have not heard of it, the Telepathy Tapes is a podcast which premiered in September 2024 and has made some waves since then. I think I heard somewhere that they outperformed like the Joe Rogan Experience for downloads or something like that.
Yes, they made it to the top of like the podcast charts on Spotify for like a very brief, I think it was like a week or something like that.
Yeah, so some waves.
It's waves.
For sure.
Yeah.
It first came up on our radars when we saw it being mentioned on Instagram by some SLPs that we follow that have pretty big followings.
These claims are big.
Yeah.
This podcast makes big claims. First of all, being from its name, it is claiming that all non-speaking autistic people, and they say all, are actually telepathic and have other psychic powers.
This podcast also heavily features a system called Spelling to Communicate, which we are going to call S2C for clarity because, and we've seen this online too, sometimes, people who use Spelling to Communicate, S2C, as like a system are called spellers, but it's like capital S spellers. But that capital S doesn't always get like carried over online or included when people are typing. So some confusion that I've seen online is people being like, what's wrong with spelling? Like reading and writing. And it's like, no, there's nothing wrong with that. But actually, S2C, Spelling to Communicate. Trademarked. It's a brand name. Yes, so the Telepathy Tapes focused on non-speaking autistic individuals who used S2C as their primary form of communication. And again, claiming that they were all telepathic and then had other psychic abilities as well. Full disclosure before we jump in, I have listened to all 10 episodes that are available right now.
I've listened to about half. I'm planning to finish them soon, but my time management skills are not the best. So that's okay, but I have listened all the way up to episode 5.
And that's okay because I think what we want to talk about today is, yes, the telepathy tapes and some of the claims that are made, but more importantly, we want to talk about pseudoscience and how to identify it, what it even is, and why it's important to identify pseudoscience in stuff like this, or identify when something is pseudoscientific. What does that even mean, right?
Absolutely.
A little bit more about Spelling to Communicate, S2C, before we dive in, because this is like a huge point in the podcast. So S2C is an AAC method that has close ties, very close ties, to facilitated communication.
Yes.
Facilitated communication is an AAC is alternative and augmentative communication. So this is communication, nonverbal communication for any person who has an impacted ability to communicate verbally. So something like a speech output device, PECS, which is picture exchange communication system. So that would be a person like handing a picture to another person. There are dozens of AAC systems, but when we say AAC, we're talking about alternative and augmentative communication.
And more importantly, we're talking about facilitated communication, which in the world of AAC is one of the only debunked forms, if not the only debunked form of AAC, which we will get into later as to why that is. But know that facilitated communication, highly controversial topic within the field of speech-language pathology.
Yes, absolutely. And S2C has very close ties to facilitated communication. Some would argue is a form of facilitated communication, but again, we're going to get into that. Another note is that S2C has posted on their official website, like in an attempt to kind of distance themselves from claims about telepathy, but they are undoubtedly connected not in the sense that like S2C is funding the telepathy tapes or anything like that, but just that a lot of the major players in both are involved with both, are connected.
It's the only form of communication. Like, it is the main mode of communication.
S2C.
Yes,
Mhm.
S2C is the main mode of communication for all autistic individuals throughout the series. It is the only form
Yes.
that has been mentioned.
Every non-speaking individual that was featured in the podcast used S2C, which is not the only form of AAC that non-speaking individuals use. So that was fishy. But like we said before, we want to talk about the telepathy tapes because it brings a larger issue to light, which is that of pseudoscience. So let's talk about pseudoscience.
What is it, Maggie?
What is it? This is just a definition from the internet, but to put it very succinctly, pseudoscience is a collection of beliefs or practices mistakenly regarded as being based on scientific method. So this would be, let's think of like some examples of maybe popular pseudoscientific things that people might know. One that jumps out for me is things like essential oils.
Yes. Essential oils for benefits beyond just like general like enjoyment of scent and relaxation.
Yes.
That one has a big old question mark and mystery about pseudoscience.
Yeah, so there will be things like, oh, there's a study that showed such and such outcome when using essential oils in place of like bleach or vinegar or something for cleaning. But then come to find out that that study was actually funded by the essential oils company. So it's kind of like, well, that really calls the validity into question. That kind of thing.
Let's see here. I'm trying
There's
to
some
think of
other ones.
Well, we mentioned it earlier off camera talking about like phrenology.
Phrenology. Yeah, what's phrenology?
Phrenology was a study, I can't remember what year, but it's old, that divined that people, you could understand more about personalities or like people based off of like the lumps and bumps on their skull. If you had a bump in a certain area, it meant certain things. This
like
was
about you as
a person.
Yes.
Fun fact, this was just used to perpetuate racism. It's not real.
It's not real. Having a bump in a certain area of your skull does not mean that you have like more artistic ability or something like that. Yeah. Yep, exactly. That's kind of an old example. Yeah. There are some other ones that are floating around, but broadly speaking, it is, that collection of beliefs or practices that kind of have this like scientific flavor to it. And I think that this is just becoming more and more popular because so much information in science is available to people now.
Gosh, yes.
Like we have a wealth of knowledge at our fingertips. And we talked about this a little bit on the last episode, like knowing how to interpret that information is absolutely paramount. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, a lot of things can look really scientific and legitimate, but actually not be at all. And I think that's kind of what we're running into with the telepathy tapes here. So why then would pseudoscience be dangerous?
Oh, pseudoscience can be dangerous. Well, thinking on the more extreme end, can lead to death. If you are following practices that do not have evidence and are unsafe, it can result in bodily injury.
Absolutely.
Or in the case of phrenology, really negative social outcomes like racism or like following very detrimental social ideology based in like loose science.
Yeah, like perpetuating harmful ideology.
Perpetuates harmful ideology to entire groups of people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in extreme cases can cause death.
Oh, yes.
But like you're totally right, where taking our essential oil, which again, like I love me some essential oils.
I love a good smell.
And yes, there are some benefits that are kind of widely accepted, but like is essential oil a replacement for an antibiotic?
No. And also there's also, thinking of essential oils specifically, some essential oils are made with like soy byproducts, and excessive use, topical use of these can lead to like breast tissue development.
Yeah.
Yep. So like there are like negative outcomes when like science is applied and then used like liberally.
Yes.
So anyways, just something to think about.
Yeah. Science is like misappropriated.
Misappropriation.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, so like an example of that would be like, okay, I love thieves oil. There are some studies to suggest that thieves oil can boost your immune system.
Which, fun fact, I actually do use thieves oil in my house because I love the smell of cloves. Fun fact.
And that's the thing, like I do associate eucalyptus and lavender and spearmint with like relaxation. And I love those scents. I like spray my eucalyptus and spearmint on my pillow every night. But like if I'm having trouble sleeping, I'm going to take a melatonin or like, you know, something like that. Something that is a little bit more, which also melatonin is like kind of wonky, but we're not going to get into that right now.
Alternative health is a huge.
Alternative health is, yeah.
But that's, you know what, that's not in our scope of practice.
Absolutely, it's not. And I think like pseudoscience can also be applied to things that are kind of like pop psychology.
Oh yeah.
Where it's like things like personality tests.
Yes, where it's like loosely based in science.
It is loosely based in science. Like there's some evidence to support it, but the wide perpetuation and usage of it is very like, it's too much. Like it's being used in ways that it's being like overextended.
Yes.
Over applied. So it can be dangerous because it can hurt people. Absolutely. One of the big things we want to talk about today, though, is how to identify pseudoscience, because it can be really tough, especially when the science seems to be high quality, like it does.
Like it does in this. I was going to say, Kai Dickens, the creator of this, speaks with great authority and great emotional appeal throughout this, which makes it harder to kind of to speak against, which is also really hard. So I think knowing some kind of through lines that you see in pseudoscience will help you to identify it in the future. Things like logical fallacies that are kind of scattered throughout telepathy tapes. One, more general pseudoscience. Yes.
And if you are familiar with logical fallacies, like harken back to that AP English, yes, or like whatever English class you took in high school or college. These come up in a lot of communications classes because they're primarily like they are an attempt at an argument based in logic that has a fatal flaw, which makes it not legitimate, and or either not legitimate or at the very least a bad argument. And so these are things that you want to avoid if you are communicating to a large group of people, or if you're trying to teach someone something, or if you're writing and producing a podcast about a pseudoscientific principle. You want to avoid these. Yes. However, what we found in listening to this podcast is that it was absolutely riddled with logical fallacies.
Oh.
They were all over the place. And personally, I feel like once you know how to identify certain types of logical fallacies, you kind of like can't unsee them.
No.
And you start to see them in other areas of life. Like you start to hear them in politicians' arguments. You start to hear them in like commercials, and even like,
absolutely,
you know, just when someone is posing a statement or an argument to you, if you are aware of these types of logical fallacies, it makes it a lot easier to be like, hang on a second.
I don't love what you're saying there.
Hang on a second. I'm not so sure about that.
One of the biggest ones that we saw throughout the telepathy tapes and that I kind of clocked within the first episode is confirmation bias. And what confirmation bias is when we interpret evidence through the lens of our own preconceived notions, and then we continue to interpret, confirm our own bias based off of the information that we have like intentionally sought out.
Yes.
And for the telepathy tapes, what that was, or how I saw it in the telepathy tapes, whereas you have parents who, well-meaning, see something, seek out a specific professional in telepathy, who then performs specific tests in telepathy, who then declares that these children are, or these adults, several of them are adults, who are telepathic. And there has been that kind of confirming of like, oh, you know what, I did think they were telepathic. I'm going to go find a specific person in telepathy to find that, and then only ever staying in that same pocket of your own bias.
Yeah, 100%.
And throughout the telepathy tapes, it's hard to then bring in outside opinions when you've only ever been stuck in the same cycle of like, I see it, I want it, I hear it, I repeat it.
Yes. Yeah. And I think strictly speaking, this is technically not a logical fallacy, but it's a cognitive bias. So
I would agree with that.
And like, I'm making that distinction only because this is something that we all do. Absolutely. Almost to the point where like, not that we can't help it, because you can help it once you're aware of it, but you have to be aware of it first.
I think of confirmation bias, and one of the best ways to kind of describe it is when you're like, you know what, I've been seeing a white Volkswagen Beetle
Mm-hmm.
around all the time. And now that you're aware of that, you're now looking for white Volkswagen Beetles, which only
Mhm.
confirms that you're seeing more white Volkswagen Beetles.
Yes.
And so while statistically speaking, you're probably seeing the exact same amount of VW bugs
Mm-hmm.
as before, you're just now aware of that specific stimulus now
Yes.
over and over and over again.
Or even like another kind of example of it would be if you are spending the night in a house because you think the house is haunted.
Ooh.
When you hear lumps and bumps and creaks and thumps that may just be the house settling, you're gonna be more likely to ascribe those to
ghost.
ghosts or
Mhm.
like paranormal activity because
Mhm.
you're already there under the assumption that it is haunted. So, and this is just something that like it's part of human psychology.
It just is. It's how our brains work.
We all do it. And so we all do it, but it can be harmful. So it's important to like be aware of it and kind of be working against it when it comes to things like science, because we love science. We want science to be high quality and like work well for us and not be like tainted by cognitive bias or polluted. I don't know. But yeah, and this, I agree with you. I think that this is absolutely like one of the primary things that we were seeing in the telepathy tapes, even to the point that at one point a camera person in the podcast talked about how he was expecting the non-speaking S2C user to begin to spell a word. And so like he had the camera trained on that part of the board where the speller was gonna start. And so like that to me is just like a very clear admission of that confirmation bias thing.
Yeah.
Not really admission of guilt, like he was doing it on purpose, but just like okay, so you're acknowledging that you were looking for it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're gonna be more likely to find it. Yeah. Another big one, and this is something that I'm kind of seeing a weird trend online, using this like logical fallacy, and this one is actually a logical fallacy, not less so a cognitive bias, but hasty generalizations.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way that this fallacy kind of reared its ugly head in the telepathy tapes was an over-reliance on anecdotal evidence. And I'm starting to see that more and more online too. So I wanted to make sure that we talked about like what makes something evidence-based. And like SLPs are probably familiar with the EBP triangle, like the evidence-based practice triangle. And it's a triangle because it's got 3 parts.
Three parts, and you can't exist without all 3.
Mm-hmm. So one of the parts is lived experience. Like it's like client experience. That's that anecdotal evidence piece of like, okay, this is what has happened to you. This is your personal experience. And that's a hugely important piece of the triangle.
Absolutely.
If that goes away, you're only left with like 2 legs. It completely collapses, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not the whole triangle.
It's not the whole triangle.
And if a lot of times when you're taught about research and how to conduct research or scientific study, like we know that self-report and anecdotal evidence is among the like less preferred forms of evidence, not because we want to invalidate the lived experience of the people that we're studying, but because everyone's lived experience is different. And it varies widely from person to person, and it can't be applied to someone else in like a perfect like one-to-one application. So I'm kind of starting to see that online of like and I think it's in an effort to validate people who have historically been silenced or like overlooked.
Yes.
So like the heart behind it is really good, but we still have to keep in mind that anecdotal evidence is not the gold standard.
No.
And I think the hasty generalization piece comes in when in the telepathy tapes they would be like, okay, this person has this lived experience, so the whole group must have the same experience.
Yes.
Or this person's experience is evidence in itself, which
sure, but that's not the whole picture of it.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Some of the other things that I saw throughout the 5 episodes of the telepathy tapes that I have witnessed, have heard.
Yeah, it's in the other ones too. It's okay.
Right. Are the appeals to false authority. They oftentimes are putting forward the credentials of people to help like boost their evidential claims.
Yes.
Whether it's like, so they were a very established like doctor or researcher. They got to know all of these really exceptional people, and then like
or there was one person in particular that they mentioned who contributed to the podcast and was not any kind of like special education or medical professional, but was like a retired lawyer. Yes. And so they kind of used that as like
because they were a retired lawyer, you should listen to them.
Exactly. Well, because it was like he really knows his stuff because he used to be a lawyer, so he can research really well. Which, like, yeah, sure, lawyers are good at research, but he was not an autism specialist, so it doesn't, it's
that false authority.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one thing I noticed is that even with people who didn't have credentials, they would
speak on it, Maggie. Speak on it.
They would put a bunch of like qualifiers. So, like a parent in the podcast was described as like vivacious and smart and clever, and I believe that she was all of those things
entirely.
But I also believe that was being used as a rhetorical device to make us trust her more,
or to make it harder to be critical of them because they're such a good person.
Yes.
And
like,
I'm
they
sure
probably are. But what does that have to do with autism?
Exactly.
Sorry, I'm gonna get a drink of water.
Go get a drink, Maggie.
Also, for those listening at home, I have had a cold this week and my voice is
you're hanging in there.
Not at its 100%, but
let's see here. Next, so they would add all these qualifiers in to support the people that they are talking about. And on the flip side of that, one thing that we also see in their very opening statements of their podcast are ad hominem attacks, or attacks on non-believers' characters. Being like, well, you're ableist if you don't think like we do, and really not. It doesn't speak to the quality of their argument, but just in the characteristics of the person who's questioning it.
Exactly.
Which is not a great way to argue.
No, it's not. And like, I think ad hominem, if I'm remembering my Latin class correctly, which I'm probably not, it means like of the person or like to a person.
Yes.
So like, it is making an argument personal in response to your statement being questioned. So like you're saying, this is very present in the intro to the podcast, is they'll say like, this group of people has been silenced because professionals don't want to listen to them because they're so closed-minded and ableist. I'm paraphrasing here. But also like, I'm paraphrasing, and if it sounds like I'm a little bit like bitter or hurt, it's because I am.
Like, as somebody who cares very deeply for this community, these ad hominem attacks, I'm not gonna lie to you, kind of smart. They hurt.
They worked on us.
They worked.
I think this is the one that we struggled with the most because, and even like you and I went back and forth. I remember texting you being like, "Am I wrong? Like, am I just being closed-minded and ableist? Like, am I wrong?" Because we talked last episode about how passionate we are about this, and like we like don't have other hobbies. Like,
no, this is it, guys.
we love what we do so much. We are so passionate about communication. We're so passionate about the populations that we work with that like when someone comes for that,
it
like,
hurts.
Ouch, girl.
Yeah.
Ouch. And ad hominem attacks are extremely effective.
Very effective.
Extremely effective, like rhetorical tools. Because they hit you where it hurts.
And it hurt.
Yeah.
It hurt.
Yeah.
And it hurt so much we made a podcast episode about it.
It hurt so much. We bought microphones.
And now we're talking about it on the internet.
Yeah, like they got us, gal. Like they
really did.
But at the end of the day, it is a logical fallacy. We are not like refusing to accept telepathy because we're so closed-minded and stuck in our paradigm. We're refusing to accept the arguments posed in the telepathy tapes because the science does not add up.
No.
So I feel safe. Like I'm trying really hard not to be an ableist, horrible, closed-minded. I'm really doing my best.
I'm really trying hard, guys.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. One of the next fallacies that we notice is something called the bandwagon fallacy, claiming that all autistic people have been silenced by a therapist, or this is like the general, this kind of goes back and similar to, like hasty generalizations, but kind of same but different. Where instead of just being like, well, everybody thinks this way, we're all hopping on the same bandwagon and being like, everybody thinks this way.
Yes. And the way that I was kind of thinking about it is that like, all therapists and teachers who do not believe in telepathy are doing
bad.
this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it's pretty similar to that hasty generalization. But again, it's like painting with a really broad brush.
Theory.
To the detriment of your own argument. So,
get him.
Maybe go back to AP Lang. Kai. No, I'm just kidding.
Renowned journalist.
Yeah, renowned investigative journalist. Another big fallacy was the either or fallacy. And this one was huge in this podcast. They, again, like we've said before, the only non-speaking autistic people that they featured in this were users of S2C or capital S spellers. That is not the only type of non-speaking autistic person.
No, it's also, it's not the only type of non-speaking autistic person. It's also not the only form of AAC. And
yes. And so I was sitting there listening to the podcast thinking okay, if I was not an SLP and I knew very little about this, I might think that SLPs are literally taking these young non-speaking children and being you will learn to communicate verbally or you will be silent. And
that's not happening, folks. And if it is happening, that's a problem.
If it is, and it has happened.
And it has happened.
In the past. So just to add credence to that, it absolutely has happened. And I do believe that there is still kind of a bias towards verbal speech as the primary mode of communication.
Mm-hmm.
However,
our options are not verbal speech or spelling to communicate that. It's either one or the other. Mm-mm.
That's the thing. Mm-hmm. The argument was very much presented as okay, these non-speaking autistic individuals either use S2C or they are silenced forever. And it's well, no.
As a promoter of total communication, I was hang on here.
Yeah, first of all,
whoa. It's not one or the other. There's so many things that we can do to support communication that are not these two options.
100%.
So to say that it's either one or the other,
yeah. And I would say that if you're going to a therapist that presents things like that to you, they are not doing a good job as a therapist.
Wow. I would agree with that.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm just whacking things. Don't worry about
it. Yeah, so that was the either or fallacy. And then this is not really a logical fallacy, but there was general vagueness and misstatements throughout the podcast as well.
I would agree with that. There was a lot of very much don't look behind the curtain.
Yeah, or oh, don't think about it too hard. That kind of thing.
And I'm moving on now.
Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest examples of this, of a misstatement, they talked about a doctor on the podcast who had her medical license revoked at one point because she published a book about telepathy. And they also, or not a book, was it a book or
it was a book? It was a book about, what was it called? ESP something.
ESP, okay. Mm-hmm. They also talked about a professional who wanted to use S2C in a school, I believe, and mentioned telepathy and was fired from their job. And I'm
hang on,
really?
As somebody who works in a school, I know that that's probably not what happened.
Yeah, it felt very much like they were leaving something out.
Yes.
And the primary reason I think that is because sometimes it's kind of hard to get fired. You have to be really, yeah. I believe that maybe for this doctor, her medical license was revoked in part because of the ESP thing, but
that can't be the only thing.
Struggle to believe that was the only reason.
I would agree with that.
There are processes, it's kind of hard to fire people for a reason. There are processes in place because of that. But yeah, so those to me felt very much like misstatements.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And yeah, just some general vagueness. One that we'll probably touch on is qualifying speech as a fine motor task, and
which again is, when speaking to kind of general vagueness, is a gross, I think in my running stream of consciousness notes while I was listening, I think I wrote multiple times this is a gross a gross under representation or misrepresentation of this. It was very simplified. Which I get
vagueness,
which I get for the sake of consumability. You have to be vague, but there was a level of vagueness that I was no, this is a gross simplification of what this process is.
100%, yes. Mm-hmm. So those To sum up, those were our major logical issues with the arguments posed in the telepathy tapes, and why we both feel pretty comfortable in saying this is pseudoscience. It's not real science. It looks like science.
It does.
It sounds like science.
Yes.
But due in part to these logical fallacies, I don't feel comfortable calling this scientifically based.
No.
The other part of why we don't feel comfortable calling it scientifically based is because of the research concerns.
Speak on it, Maggie.
Okay, so they did show some like tests for telepathy. I say show. They have videos available on their website, which are, drumroll please,
Behind a paywall.
behind a paywall. Yes. Which, like, honestly, it's a gig economy. Make your money, girl. But at the same time, that another kind of element of pseudoscience to me is, are they trying to sell you something?
I would agree with that. Oftentimes, I see online things that are kind of presented with like this like half-cocked research that's like, it's good for you, we promise, but here you have to buy this product in order to like reap the benefit of it.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that always rings as like a grift, or like something is amiss there. If you're trying to sell me something, it makes me very, very speculative.
Same. Yeah. So the fact that it was behind a paywall makes me go, But anyway, I digress. The tests were set up in a way to seem very scientific. And I think that they did an okay job.
If you don't know about research design, it's going to be very hard to be like, what's wrong with that?
Right.
Because it seems from the outside very watertight.
Yeah.
However, there were several times where I was like,
wait a second. Yeah.
There's room for bias here. There's room for limitation. Like there's limitations with every study. Point blank period. That's why we have a limitation study or a limitations section within research articles. We have to talk about the things that we couldn't account for. And for them to be like, this is a bulletproof study. Girl.
Yeah.
No,
it can be good.
It can be good.
It can be almost
bulletproof. Nothing is bulletproof in research.
Especially when you're studying I feel like psychology and like human behavior is one of the fields that's like more susceptible to that type of thing.
Remember, so I'm also a psychology. When I was getting my undergrad, I was a CSD major and I was also a psychology major. And I remember in some of my psychology classes talking about research and things coming down to like limitations in studies being like the temperature of the air in the room. Like, could that affect people's mood? Could it have had an effect on the research and the outcomes that we saw? There are things that you cannot account for when you're doing a study. And so to be like, we accounted for everything, this is totally bulletproof.
Is it? Yeah. Yeah. So there was that piece of just like natural limitations of all studies and tests. But some of the like kind of more concrete issues that I had with it, the studies and tests mentioned were not particularly rigorous. And by that, I mean a couple of things. One is that they didn't control for enough variables. So kind of those things that we were talking about before. One of the tests in the very first episode, I think they are at like an Airbnb with the test subject and her family. The family's primary language was Spanish, so there was an interpreter there, but the interpreter was a close personal friend.
And not a professional interpreter.
Yes, just a person who spoke Spanish. And again, like, girl, you do what you can to translate when you're in a pinch. Like, that's something that you do when you're in a pinch. If you are trying to run a study or trying to do something medical or scientific, you get an interpreter, like a professional interpreter.
You get a professional.
So that to me was just like, that's a variable that they did not control for. They were in an Airbnb, which is just like, okay, that's just some random place, right? They don't really have a lot of control over the environment. There were not really control groups, which like not every study has to have a control group.
Sometimes it's impossible to have or unethical to have a control group.
Absolutely.
And so like that's not entirely necessary all the time. It does help.
But even though if you don't have a control group, you should have some kind of different test group or like something that you are also testing
to compare baseline to.
And again, like, okay, fine, not always, like you don't always strictly speaking have to have that. But in a case like this, where you're trying to test whether or not this person has telepathic powers,
That's a big claim, folks.
You are going to want to have, like, try and control for as many variables as possible because people are really good at reading nonverbal cues.
Very good.
Very, very good at it.
It's kind of like our brains were designed to do so. Even both allistic and autistic brains. Like, our brains are meant to pick up patterns.
Yeah.
And so...
Ooh, can you quickly define what allistic is?
Yes. So we have autistic brains, or brains that process information differently. Allistic is kind of the descriptive term to talk about everybody who's not autistic.
Yeah. Which, like, I think it's a really helpful term.
I do too.
Honestly.
Because you can be... this is a tangent. You can be neurodiverse and not autistic. Like, you could have alcohol syndrome, you can have intellectual disabilities. Like, those are all anxiety, ADHD. I'm trying to think of other things that fall under, like, the neurodiverse umbrella. But regardless, there's a lot. You can be neurodiverse and not autistic, and not allistic either.
Yep.
So that's why we have these terms.
It does also serve to kind of remove some of the stigma of, like, oh, this person's autistic and this person's normal.
The use of the term typical is one that, like, brings me, like, grief or, like, strife.
I'm okay with typical because I think that it can be used in a very mathematical way of, like,
my friend Maggie loves a bell curve.
I love a bell curve, girl. And so, like, what is typical
for
statistically speaking?
There it is.
To me, it means so, and I think you're totally
I am in the same boat where to me typical is this range between 85 to 115 or whatever those numbers are on the. But for people who do not take stats courses, typical oftentimes can denote one type of being. And so I think by having these extra terms, it helps to just be a little bit more specific.
Yeah.
In what we're talking about.
I totally agree with you. Yeah. I should probably. Yeah, maybe reevaluate.
That's the only reason. That's the only reason why I have beef with it is because I think if you don't understand that typical is a range, it can be a little pigeonholy.
Okay, that's really fair. That's very valid. So that's allistic. I think the tests were not rigorous. In my opinion, they did not control for enough variables. Another thing was an over-reliance on case studies or studies with very small sample sizes.
And case studies, while an important feature and an important research style, we can't always rely on just case studies. You need to have the bigger, the rule of thumb is the bigger sample size you have, kind of the more reliable that your data is for the most part.
And again, it does depend on what you're studying.
Sure.
But for something like this, if we're going to claim that all non-speaking autistic people have this ability and you studied 30 autistic people, it's like
30 autistic people whose parents also claim that they saw telepathic tendencies. I would have even given them more credence if they had tested non-speaking autistic people whose parents were not claiming that they were telepathic. Like, that would have been even a really good comparison. Like, that could have been your other group that you're comparing to.
Or just, like, point blank period, autistic people, non-speaking autistic people who didn't use S2C. That was a huge, I think we've already talked about this.
I don't know if we have, but I got to tell you, I got real big beef with them only using this one specific system, specifically one that's so related to facilitated communication, which they spoke on in the podcast.
In the vaguest possible terms.
Not only in the vaguest possible terms, but to call, I got beef with this one too, to call in, it was, they had conveyed the information as we are bad people or SLPs to be calling into question facilitated communication, and that we are denying people access, which really bothers me.
Those ad hominem attacks
again, specifically, and we'll talk about this later, when there's so many other forms that we know work. It's not the one, once again, this either or situation. Like, it's not just that one. And so to be like, you're evil if you don't do this one thing.
Yeah, how dare you deny an autistic person a voice because they're not using S2C. And it's like, well, yeah.
We'll get into that later. I'm still kind of heated about this.
Yes. Yeah, so very small sample sizes, over-reliance on case studies and that type of thing. Another thing that, and this maybe didn't happen so much in the podcast, but this is more a comment on S2C themselves. Some of the research that I've seen that they have listed on their website also cites studies that are like more than 15 years old. Which kind
of rule of thumb is anything over like 10 is kind of like
you just want to try to have the most current research available as like what you're going off of. So if you have a research study from, and there are some like seminal studies that are from like the 80s or the 90s.
Or I'm thinking about my motor speech disorder class. Like all of the research was from the 60s, and that's because it's just so rock solid that we've been like, no, we know that maybe it was the 70s. Sorry, Dr. Jones. I don't remember.
You've slept since then. It's okay.
But regardless, it was like landmark and like cornerstone research.
Yeah.
Like, these are big studies that are older, but they were really awesome. And that's where we get a lot of our information from.
So it's something that like in and of itself is not inherently bad, but it's just something to keep in mind. So if you're reading research and a lot of the studies that they're citing are from like the early 2000s at this point, you're going to want to go, okay, is there anything more recent that either corroborates this or that shows the opposite or shows a different outcome? So it's just like kind of something to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
But my science brain was like, that is from 2004. So anyway, let's move on to some concerns with S2C itself, because we have concerns. So my primary concern is it all hinges on spelling to communicate, right? That's S2C, spelling to communicate. How are they teaching literacy?
Which I'm so glad you're talking about this, because literacy is kind of your wheelhouse. There are some like, and you've talked about in the past, kind of are more uncommon spelling patterns that like unless you're explicitly taught, you're not going to pick up on. So how are they teaching literacy through this mode, right?
Yeah. And so something that I was thinking about, and this is like a wonder, this is a question of mine, and another thing that is kind of a orange to red flag for me is that I'm having a hard time finding out how they're teaching literacy. It's not posted on their website in a place that I have looked yet. And it's not, I like couldn't even find anything like on Reddit about it. Like it was very,
you're digging deep when you're looking at Reddit.
Well, when I would like Google search, which again, this is not like cutting edge research, but like a quick, give it a goog. I was like, all right, well, S2C, how are you teaching literacy? And kind of Googled stuff like that, like S2C literacy ? Like very like, I don't know.
A cursory search.
A cursory glance, because I would hope that it would be kind of immediately available.
Absolutely.
Even if you have to dig for it a little bit, I would hope that I would be able to find it.
I feel like on other places that teach literacy, for example, Orton Gillingham, I feel like I have perused their website and they're like, this is how we teach this through like really rigorous phonics and phonological awareness instruction, and then like move up the tiers. Like I can at least find, you don't have to give me the specific information. I know you want me to get trained and I know you want me to pay for it.
That's the other thing. I was like, I get that this is proprietary information.
Yeah. However, but like you at least show me how you do and why you do, you know? And so for that information to be like not easily accessible,
right,
makes me nervous.
Yes. Yeah, one of my huge questions for S2C, and if someone can answer this for me, please do.
We want to be enlightened, and I think that's one thing that we wanted to like really highlight with this podcast in particular is like we're not the authorities here. So like if you have information, please enlighten us. We are open to discussions about this, because I feel like that's where we get the best advancement, is when we can have respectful and open conversations about this. So if you know the answer, share it. I want to know.
And I will say in my like short perusal of the stuff available on S2C's website, I did come across a research paper that they had cited called Literacy in Non-Speaking Autistic People, I think. And in the introduction to that paper, they talked about how there aren't really any evidence-based literacy instruction curricula for non-speaking autistic people. Fair. That is so true. And also to their point, there aren't a ton. Well, okay, reading and speech are very closely connected at this point. A lot of really rigorous and like direct instruction, like, okay, so Orton Gillingham, the program that I'm getting trained in, is like, you got to be able to say the sounds. Like, it's very, very rooted in kind of that speech element, which works for the majority of people. But when we're talking about this really specific population of non-speaking individuals, something like Orton Gillingham is going to have a big gap or hole, you know, like, yeah. So that's fair. That's a decent point. So then my question would be, okay, then how are you teaching it? And back to your point about like kind of rare or like low frequency spelling conventions, I was thinking to myself today before we started recording this, like, okay, what if it was a word that maybe the speller had only heard and never seen written, like chaotic. Chaotic has some like low frequency. It's got that Greek root, so it's got that ch for the k sound at the beginning, and then it has a short I but no short vowel signal at the end. It's just got the c instead of ck, and then it has that ao vowel blend in the middle, that chaotic, which like it's a common enough word, but it's a pretty
it's a unique spelling.
It's got some unique aspects to it. So like maybe a typically developing child that's learning how to spell, they might spell it kind of more phonetically using like more English spelling conventions. Like they might do like Kayoti. Like they might, CK, something like that. There are ways that we would see misspellings that give us insight into like, okay, how were they trying to spell
where's their
that
brain
word?
at with putting those like rules together?
Are spellers doing that?
I don't know.
Are they producing spelling errors? Because my spelling is not 100% accurate. I misspell words. Like I have some words that like I think to myself,
a shirt that says language.
Language.
I can't spell.
You flip the A and the U
all the time.
Or like even believe, like those vowel teams. Those are tricky. They're tough.
What? This is me outing myself. This is embarrassing. I couldn't spell pilot for the longest time.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I was taking a German class that it was like pilot, and I was like,
I still can't spell the word receipt.
Oh.
It's French. I don't know.
It's
So there's stuff like that where like these are things that all literate people still struggle with. So are spellers are they producing errors like that would be expected? Because if not,
why?
I have questions. No one is 100% perfect. So yeah, I have big questions about that. Another thing about spellers in S2C is that they have this plastic letterboard, or sometimes it'll be a piece of laminated paper that just has all capital letters in alphabetical order in 3 rows that they are trained to point or stick like a pencil at or through.
Which I know from you've explained it to me, and I was like, whoa, you're blowing my mind with this. Capital letters are not the majority of letters.
Yeah, like when we're reading something, it's like 2% of letters are capitalized or something like that. So when you're teaching a kid to read and write, or just a person, some people learn to read later. It's a skill that has to be taught. When you're teaching a student to read and write, you want to begin with lowercase letters because they're more frequent. And not all uppercase letters are just a big version of the lowercase letter.
So like very different. A, for example, start with the first one.
Yeah, H too is another one. A lot of them. So how was the letterboard designed? How did they land on that? Why did they go with capitals?
What evidence do they have supporting that this design is the best design? Because from my point of view, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and their whole thing is it being like a motor-based approach. But wouldn't you put the more frequent letters up at the top? Like, wouldn't you put like SATPIN?
Speak to what a motor, when we're thinking about motor movements in communication, can you kind of speak to what that means before we start talking about like motor planning and motor programming? Because we're going to dive into it.
We're going to get into it. Yeah. So, okay, yes. Let's go ahead and just talk about motor planning. So when we talk about motor, we're talking about movements that our body makes. Fine motor is very fine, detailed movements, things like sewing, buttoning, zipping, typing,
tying shoes,
anything that...
Unwrapping a Hershey Kiss.
Yes, anything that involves very small, coordinated movements would be a fine motor task. A gross motor task would be something like running, jumping, walking, raising,
crawling.
Yeah, crawling, like anything that's a big motor movement, big muscle movement. Fine motor and gross motor tasks can be really difficult for people with a number of disabilities.
They can be secondary to a whole lot.
And so what S2C is claiming is that because speech is a fine motor task and pointing is a gross motor task,
which, okay, hang on here.
Mhm.
I actually have two complaints with that. So
Yeah.
first of all,
Get into it.
first of all, speech is more than just a fine motor task, right? Because
100%.
it occurs in two areas of the brain.
I love the brain.
I love the brain. Luckily, I have brain. It occurs in two areas, both with our motor cortex, which runs across our head like a headband here, but also in our language centers. Those are both firing simultaneously. So it's not just one task.
Yep.
Same with pointing. You need the fine motor task to be able to isolate a finger. And also move an arm. So like
neither one of them are exactly what they're saying that they are.
Once again, it goes back to kind of vague details. It's a little. It's not a little. It's an oversimplification of what two processes are.
Yes.
Right? Because this and this.
100%.
That's more than just fine.
Yeah.
Or even holding a pencil, like to hold. Like I'm holding this microphone right now. I'm having to use 1, 2, 3 fingers in what is essentially a tripod grasp. And that is a fine motor task as well. So like to hold a pencil or to hold something in point. Like,
and then to also like aim it through a cutout.
You have to have visual acuity skills for that.
Like, yeah, or aim it to a printed letter that's like 2 inches big. That is that's like a pretty highly coordinated.
That's a
movement.
Very skilled task. You have to have very acute or like very fine skills for that.
And so for our patients and clients that struggle with motor movement and motor planning, a lot of the motor-based interventions that we will use train a specific motor movement that is going to be the same every time. So some other, which spoiler alert, we're going to talk about motor-based AAC like systems that are not S2C, but like in LAMP, you'll hit the button and then there's another button that pops up right underneath it, so you don't even have to move your hand. And those are for those high frequency. So if you like hit I, the next button under it would be want. And then your items, it'll auto-populate the items, and they're going to be in the same position on the page every single time. And so that it takes away that like having to coordinate and like rewrite a new motor plan for each and every item because the pathway is predictable. And so for an alphabetical order board, I do wonder why it's set up like that.
Specifically when the end goal is typing, which is
not alphabetical order.
Which is not alphabetical.
And is also not gross motor.
Yes, Maggie. So I just have a lot of questions about like, maybe this just means I need to take the course, guys. Because am I going to get answers from this there? Because folks, I'm confused.
Yeah.
If you're working on training the motor plan for the board with the long-term goal of being typing, it doesn't make sense to me that you train 2 totally different motor plans.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. This is once again going back to like, am I wrong?
Am I crazy?
Am I crazy?
No, I don't think so. I, as your totally unbiased third-party opinion of your friend.
Thank you, Maggie.
I don't think you're crazy. Okay, so girl, why is this dangerous?
Okay. Lots of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Hold on, I gotta cross my arms for this because I'm okay. So I have problems with telepathy tapes as a whole being dangerous because one of the things that I'm kind of upset about is a lot of like intellectual disability erasure through this thing. They made claims throughout the whole thing that these people, and they use that, these people are locked inside and like trapped. They're typical people who are trapped inside. And for my friends who are non-speaking who also have intellectual disabilities, it kind of hurt my feelings.
Yeah.
So once again, let me bring that emotional appeal in. For my friends who don't have, who do have intellectual disabilities, and are also non-speaking, it was very much like, well,
your lived experience isn't valid.
It's not
because,
valid. It's not valid because of these people over here.
Exactly.
And I didn't love that. I also didn't love that they glazed over kind of talking about the really difficult parts of autism. Autism is
the like disabling parts of autism.
Autism, I know, who is it? Kaylin?
Kaylin, like MVP, is that her? Yes. Yeah, or Kaylin VP.
Who herself is autistic and is a huge autism advocate.
On Instagram, look her up. She's
slays. Fantastic.
I love her. Yep.
Talks often about that, like, for some people, autism is incredibly disabling. And to kind of glaze over that parts of it really diminishes the autistic experience.
Yeah.
And we've talked about it before. We being you and I, are very disability neutral. It's not good, it's not bad, it just isn't. To erase or just not talk about a really significant part of that doesn't paint the whole picture.
Yeah. Some of the things that autistic people, especially like high support needs, which the individuals in this podcast were high support needs, meaning that they need support for like almost all, if not all, tasks of daily living. So like feeding, toileting, hygiene, and like lots of kind of academic or like living tasks they would need some level of support for. What is common in that population is also like kind of secondary disabilities or impairments, something like pica, so like compulsive eating of non-food objects, self-injurious behaviors, elopement. They did touch on a little bit, but didn't really talk about how dangerous it can be.
Absolutely.
Even things like sleep disturbances and like very intense sensory needs, or difficulty toileting, like not being independent going to the bathroom,
or having like they kind of touch on this, but once again it was very vague. They talked about like low body sensation, and to have like poor interoception. Yeah, I've got that.
Proprioception.
Well, so they're different because you got intro and then right? I could be wrong about that because I feel like proprioception is where your body's in its space. Interoception is your ability to look inside your body,
feeling inside
be aware of your body inside.
Okay,
does that make sense?
Yeah,
I feel like that makes sense. If I'm wrong about that, I'm sorry, OTs.
Please forgive us.
Please forgive us. So they kind of touched on that in Akil's story, talking about where he didn't have a ton of body awareness, but then doesn't talk about the next part of that, which is why it matters when it comes to like moving around in space, or like having body awareness to know that this feeling means I have to go to the bathroom. And so like,
or body awareness to know that this means I am being injured right now by the movement that I'm making, or by, you know, what is happening to me. Like we know people that have had concussions and like not really been aware of it, and have also not been able to keep themselves safe following that because they don't know that hitting their head that hard is bad. So some of those like truly disabling parts of autism were completely glossed over
and phrased in a way that made it seem like they were quote unquote normal inside. And I really don't love that.
Yeah.
Once again, going back to my like hatred of the term like normal and typical, like I feel like that really does a disservice to their lived experience.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that. Yeah, I think that those ideologies especially are pretty dangerous to perpetuate, because there is real disability and real danger that comes with being high support autistic, being non-speaking autistic.
And to present it in any way other than like sometimes you need help will sometimes limit people from getting the help that they need, or getting services to address those concerns.
Absolutely.
And so once again, going back to overgeneralizations, if you make these broad sweeping claims about all autistic people, you could be cutting people off from services that could really improve their quality of life, or just make them feel or just enjoy life more. Like I think, by making those big statements, you're kind of cutting people off from maybe getting help.
100%. Yeah. So we've talked about our issues with S2C. We've talked about our issues with the telepathy tapes. Let's talk about like some actual evidence-based AAC methods.
Before we do that, I am going to ask that we talk a little bit about facilitated communication. We kind of, that was my hip.
Girl.
Just all types.
Are you okay?
No, you and I are both falling apart today, right?
It's true.
Let's talk about a little bit of the history of facilitated communication. We kind of brushed on it, but why is it a problem? And why is spelling to communicate kind of tangentially related to that?
Yeah.
And so facilitated communication in, I believe, the 80s or 90s, I think it was the 90s, underwent some scrutiny after people who were using facilitated communication were allegedly making kind of big legal claims of abuse, and which should always be taken seriously. And so, but what they found through tests of facilitated communication were that it wasn't actually the autistic person speaking, but rather the person who was facilitating their communication. And what I mean by facilitating their communication was the FC people posit that by placing pressure on, my hands are so cold. I'm so sorry.
Too.
By putting pressure here
Mm-hmm.
on the forearm, on the elbow, or on the shoulder,
Yeah.
and helping to, imagine there's a letterboard
Yeah.
right in front of Maggie. By helping to push pressure, it helped them to get over the motor ideation or the planning part of
Yeah.
motor movements. I'm holding my mic too close. To help get their messages out.
Mm-hmm.
However, in doing so, what ended up happening is I, the facilitator, was moving the arm and accidentally making the messages when the autistic person was not.
Yes.
And they tested this by putting a divider between these two people,
Mm-hmm.
showing the facilitator one image and the autistic person another image. And what they ended up finding is that the autistic person's responses were always what the facilitator saw.
Yeah.
So they were like,
Yeah.
the person who's communicating is not actually the autistic person.
And I think it's important to note here that I don't believe that communication partners were knowingly or purposefully doing this.
That was
I know you don't believe that either.
Oh,
yeah.
no. But that, you bring up a good point. That was one of the
Mhm.
biggest things, is that this was all happening unconsciously. Their body was just, the facilitator's body was just moving their arms because their brain, which we don't, once again, it's something I have to concede on, we don't know a lot about the brain. We know a lot. We don't know everything about the brain.
Yeah.
Was unconsciously moving the other person's arms to make messages that their own brain crafted.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was deemed from that point on that this was not a valid and safe form of communication, because it also wasn't honoring the autistic person's actual messages, and they might actually have things to say, but somebody else is moving their arm.
Right.
And so one of my big beefs with the spelling to communicate, which uses very similar things, instead of having, they do concede to several times throughout the podcast talking about having to put physical pressure on hands, wrists, arms, elbows, shoulders, foreheads, top of head. Yeah. So there is still contact between a facilitator and a communicator. But the big issue I also have with spelling to communicate is that they're like, well, we don't touch them. However, you're holding a board.
Yeah.
You're holding.
We didn't talk about that earlier.
No, you're holding a communication board, which also gives you the unconscious chance to move the board around.
Yeah. The letterboard is not being. It's not stationary.
It's not static.
It's
not
held
static.
by a
and as
person.
much as because they often are like, they held it completely still. Unless it is affixed to a surface or resting upon a surface, it is not static.
100%.
So anyways, spelling to communicate is also loosely based off of facilitated communication.
It has ties to it at the very least.
Yeah. And then they also mentioned another version called the rapid prompting method, which does have full assist of an arm and a board. And so that is, it looks, girl, if it looks like a duck and it sounds like a duck. But that being said, their whole reason for doing this is to get over the motor planning hump, right? To get the message out, they have to get over the motor planning hump. And so from my clinical brain, it doesn't make sense to me as to why you would choose these paths when we have so many other AAC systems that were created with motor planning in mind. For example, POD, Pragmatically Organized Dynamic Display. I love POD. If you are looking for another system that is low tech but robust and still has access to spelling, POD has it. POD was created. POD all the way.
Yeah.
POD was created by
our Lord and Savior Gail.
My Lord and Savior Gail Porter. I went to a training with her as one of the lead presenters, and she was training 2 other people. It was like a religious experience. Anyways, through that, she talks about, she created this system, interestingly, around the same time facilitated communication came about, which was
I hadn't made that connection.
Yeah, so they kind of existed at the same time, which made Gail be like, I have to prove this even more because this form of low-tech AAC is being called under fire, but I'm not doing that. So this system was originally created for people with cerebral palsy. Talk about like
motor concerns.
King of motor concerns right now.
Yeah.
And so in doing so, she designed this book of robust language that was trying to minimize motor movements so that you can conserve your planning energy. And so to get within, once again, you have to pay for the class. But regardless, it was created with motor planning in mind. And it also has a total access, like total option for spelling too. And she talks very openly about it needs to be taught in conjunction with a high quality literacy program. And so this addresses both of those concerns for literacy and motor movement. This is an awesome option. So why, in my brain, you have this system that has now been used with more people than just people with cerebral palsy, right?
Yeah.
We are now using it with people with, she showed so many rare conditions with motor movements. A kid with Crudeshaw, Rett syndrome, deletion syndromes, or like just a wide variety of people, even people with hearing loss. Like this was, or like some type of comorbidity of like hearing loss and other motor concerns. And she has really thought of everything. So if your motor concerns are to the point that maybe you cannot access it independently, she has thought of systems that have like partner assisted scanning, which still allow the person with motor concerns to be able to communicate their message autonomously. And there is no room for facilitator. Like there's no room for the communication partner to influence the message. So to me, it makes much more sense to use a system like Pod if you're wanting a low-tech access system that also has spelling and also has like was created with motor concerns in mind instead of S2C. Beyond just low tech, because Pod is also high tech, but its main creation was a low tech book.
What do you mean by low tech?
Low tech is something that does not require electricity. Mid tech is something that has a charge but is not like fully electronic. High tech would be like an iPad or computer system. So if you're looking for something that is low tech, for example, the plastic spelling board of S2C would be considered low tech.
Very much so.
Pod's paper books, low tech. Even when we move to things that are higher tech, we have systems that are designed with motor planning in mind. LAMP, language acquisition through motor planning, or like there's an extra word in there that I'm not 100%. LAMP was designed with motor planning in mind, specifically with autistic people in mind.
And that's the one we were talking about before, where like it minimizes the number of times you have to move,
and nothing ever moves. So once you know the pathway to that icon,
you can find it without looking.
I know that because I've had kids.
I've seen
fully looking the other way.
100%.
So let's see here. Toby Dynavox has a motor planning page set as well. And so there's so many other things that were formulated with motor concerns in mind that take the onus, like that take the motor plan, that relieve the motor planning pathways without having to use another person. Or even, like with Pod, that when you do need another person to help support communication due to motor concerns, it's done in a way that is not influenceable. Anyways, I'm still mad about this, guys.
Get into it.
It just,
and even on top of that, there are other like assistive tech kind of add-ons that can go with AAC devices for people that have complex bodies or like complex motor needs. So things like key guards, if they have a hard time isolating one button, it's this like plastic grid that can go over and really helps with that like tactile piece of.
It helps with the tactile piece. So if you can't isolate a finger, it allows you to put a whole hand and then push a finger through or push a thumb through or a stylus, whatever. Like we have so much other assistive technology that has motor concerns in mind. That once again, I'm like, why would you choose that one?
Right. That one that is like at best controversial.
That is at best controversial and at worst wrong. Like,
yeah.
Anyways, so this is also to say that like this is not us dissing spelling. Lowercase s spelling and literacy is one of the biggest game changers for our non-speaking individuals. Let me be clear. We love the act of lowercase s spelling.
We love literacy.
We love literacy in this house. Okay. And so I think that's one of the things that gets conflated a lot in this podcast is like they're against spelling, or even discourse that I've seen online in SLP communities where they're like, is ASHA, our governing body, against lowercase s literacy?
Right.
No, we are not.
There's been some confusion kind of sown, which like, again, intentional or unintentional.
And once again, typing itself, I am all for. If you can type, cool.
Great.
Like that's another valid form of alternative and augmentative communication. However, if we're getting our prerequisites to that are through facilitated communication, I just have so many questions. And to me, the risk of the messages not being truly from the person that I am working with is too high of a cost for me when I have other options that are available that take into mind the same issues.
Agreed 100%. And and kind of like as we talked about before, like yes, we're kind of getting into the weeds with the telepathy tapes specifically, but a lot of the things that we've talked about today can be applied to like pseudoscience in general. So if you are investigating some method or program or whatever that claims to be based in science, thinking about, all right, well, who was this funded through? Where did the money come from? How much do I have to pay to access like basic information about this?
Are there any conflicts of interest?
Are there conflicts of interest?
You had mentioned that Akil's family had paid for research studies that is now being cited on the S2C
website.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That is a conflict of interest.
Yeah. And it's even if it's not a conflict of interest, it's at least like a connection.
It's at least it's that sound to me.
It's a connection to be aware of. Even those things like logical fallacies and those cognitive biases that we are all prone to, those are important things to know because there's a lot of information out there. Science is really having her moment right now, and we love that for her. But like, not everything is evidence-based. And the quality of evidence-based practice can vary pretty widely. So it's really important to be able to know how to look critically at something, especially something that looks too good to be true, and kind of assess like, okay, how firmly rooted in evidence is this? You bring up
another point that I kind of forget about sometimes, but when things are kind of like packaged and sold as like this magic bullet answer or like this magic, I think that's the word I'm looking for, like a magic, like this is it, like this is the best thing ever. Oftentimes things that are too good to be true are too good to be true. And that's not to say parts of it can't be true. However, like this whole thing is just kind of,
It's the evidence does not add up for me at all. So in conclusion, yes, there are parts of the human experience that we can explain. Telepathy is out of our scope of practice. You keep saying this.
Look, man, it is not within my scope of practice, and until there is evidence that supports that it is, I will continue to concede that like I can't speak to that because I just don't know.
Yep, we just don't know, and that's okay. And to me, that's okay. We don't have to know everything, and there's something very human in searching.
Yes.
And finding meaning in those experiences that we can't necessarily explain.
Absolutely. That's part of the mystery of being human. And that's fine, great, dandy, whatever. Like I said, this is outside of my scope of practice. However, what is within my scope of practice is the fact that there are better forms of AAC than what I am seeing being presented. Than S2C. And once again, we kind of talk about this. I know that everything starts out not as evidence-based, and you have to gather an evidence-based. So sure, if in time evidence shows that S2C is better than FC, sure, I will gladly eat my hat.
That's the thing. I'm like, jury's still out technically on S2C.
I'm not loving it.
It's not looking good.
I'm not loving it, and that's just from part of that evidence-based practice triangle is past research. And so until I see enough that I'm like, okay, maybe. Yeah, I'm not willing to chance it. Specifically when I know that there are other systems that work better.
Same. Another thing to conclude with is that autistic people are people, and non-speaking.
I feel like we shouldn't have to say this. Like it's really baffles me. This is one thing. Sorry, I'm not done yet. Actually,
get into it.
That's one thing that I really take beef with is that, like, the presentation of like autistic people weren't people until they started communicating telepathically. Girl, they have been people the whole time. And if you haven't seen that, I'm sorry that you missed out on it. But like, they were people before having a human experience.
And they are deserving of like the respect and dignity that are afforded to every other person.
Everybody.
And so what I do like,
I'm still not over it. Sorry, continue.
What I will give points to the telepathy tapes too, is that even though I disagree with and do not like the execution, I think the heart behind it was solid. Of like, we want to show that these non-speaking autistic individuals are people and that they are worth listening to.
Yes.
And that I can 100% get behind.
Everything
after that sentiment, execution-wise,
I have questions
did not
about.
agree with.
No, I have questions about.
Yep.
One thing that they talk a lot about, once again, I'll say this in kind of in summation, one of the things that they talked often about was presuming competence. And that word gets thrown around. Fun fact, folks, that those words were tied to the FC movement. That verbiage came from
presuming competence.
Those two words came out of the FC movement. I much prefer terms like open expectations or presuming possibilities and potential. Because for some autistic people that have co-occurring intellectual disabilities, sometimes competence isn't there, and that's okay too. And I feel like that's one thing that I really took beef with, is that it's kind of undercutting or just excluding people who maybe don't fall under that competent and savant, or even like beyond competent into savantism category, and that's totally denying their experience. And that's to not be competent is okay. We are going to love you and include you in this human experience regardless. And so I think we got stuck too much on competent, which in and of itself is kind of ableist. And there's me using an ad hominem fallacy.
She said, I'm attacking you personally.
I'm attacking you personally now.
Well, competence, not being competent in something does not make you any less deserving of,
or any less capable of potentially or future-wise being competent.
Sure, yeah,
I talked to you about this. I use the example of like, you should not presume that I am competent in flying an airplane because I cannot. However, you should not assume that I will never learn how to fly an airplane if I choose to do so. If I choose to learn how to fly an airplane, you should trust that I have the possibility to one day learn. But yeah, to assume in this moment that I can fly an airplane, I am sorry to break your heart. We're going down, folks.
We're going down. We're going to crash.
Yeah,
very much so. So yeah, the telepathy tapes is likely pseudoscience. I would go so far to say is definitely pseudoscience. The reasons for that are numerous. We have spent the last hour talking about why. It's riddled with logical fallacies and presents some really dangerous ideology, which you're speaking to, is dangerous for an extremely vulnerable population.
Yes.
And we have to be vigilant against
and mindful
things
of that.
Like that. Yeah, especially in today's day and age where information is so widely available, and algorithms and stuff on the internet.
Oh, I got an ad for LinguaLeap, a supplement that is supposed to support speech and language development. In case you are concerned about that, you should be.
In case you aren't concerned about that, try again.
Yeah. Because, okay, this is getting into a whole lot.
Yeah, this is another
rabbit hole. The too long didn't read version of it is that the one research article that they cite actually says that it doesn't work. Fun fact.
Yikes.
Anyways, I'm going to move on now.
But betting on the fact that most people aren't going to look that far.
Yes.
And just kind of take the advertisement at face value. We see this a lot with like headlines. Like you look at a headline of like X increases the chance of Y, but like we're not going to actually look into
or explain in detail why X and Y are either correlated or causational.
Are they causative? Is it? So it's very, very important to be looking at research, and especially things that claim to be scientific, with a shrewd eye. And looking out for those logical fallacies, because girl, they're everywhere.
They're everywhere.
Around every corner. And they're going to get you. Final thoughts.
Final thoughts are, I'm still mad, but that's neither here nor there. Sorry, my husband just texted me and said we should get Chili's, and I agree with him.
Get you some Chili's.
I just got fully derailed there. Okay, so final thoughts here are, there are things about the human experience that we don't know. And there's things that are outside of my scope of practice that I may never know about. However, within my scope of things that I can control, I don't love S2C, and I don't love RPM or facilitated communication. And I think that when you're working with a non-speaking autistic person, you need to do a very good AAC evaluation that is dynamic, and by that I mean constantly evolving and not always formal, to best see what works for them. Because maybe spelling using typing is what works for them. Maybe it's not. You need to match that to your person. And not paint a broad picture of only giving them one system because that's a system that you like. That's my big takeaway for this, is the importance of AAC evaluation. Work.
I love it.
What you got, girl? What's your takeaway?
My big takeaway is just like we have to be critical when we're evaluating claims of scientific evidence. Just know what you're looking for, and it's okay to be skeptical.
And it's following that. Sorry, I'm gonna hijack your.
Go for it.
It's okay to get got by this sometimes. It's meant to like be confusing sometimes, and so you are not a bad person for getting hoodwinked, because that's what it's meant to do.
You're also not dumb for getting hoodwinked. Logical fallacies are really powerful, and they're still around for a reason. If they didn't work, we would have stopped using them. It's so easy. I said before, but like I would text you and be like, "Am I crazy? Like, is telepathy real? Like, am I
a bad clinician for not considering this?"
Yes,
and the answer is no.
Right.
But once again, we have a discerning eye. We considered the evidence, and for us, it was not enough.
Yeah. So be careful out there.
It's spooky out there, guys.
It's tough out there. There's a lot of information available. Not all of it is great. Be shrewd, be skeptical, and be
good
smart.
luck.
Yeah,
Godspeed. Good luck
and Godspeed. So we hope that you feel a little less lost thinking about the telepathy tapes, facilitated communication, S2C, etc. But as always, there's much to think about.
So much to think about. You guys can find us on YouTube right now. I don't know if we have Spotify set up yet, but we're getting there.
Not yet, but maybe when this one comes out, we will.
Who knows? You can definitely find us on YouTube, though, and on Instagram at Tell Me About It SLP.
Mm-hmm.
We hope to see you soon.
See you next time. Bye.